Good morning, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
This is July 24th, episode 66 of Transmission. And we've got some guests today, so maybe we could start by introducing ourselves. I'll start, and then do we want to work through Dan up and around?
Yeah. I'll introduce our guests briefly, and then they'll take over.
For those who are tuning in and don't know who we are, I'm Mark Van Steenhoek. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And while we were waiting to go on, I realized that if there were 6 of us, this would be episode 666.
Whoa. Everything the conservatives say about us is true.
That's right. So it's a good thing that there aren't 6 of us. Anyway, yeah, I'm very excited. As many of you have been watching know, we occasionally have guests. I was looking this up before we started. We have not had a guest for 21 episodes. Last guest we had was Gus from Portland in episode 45. And so today we have 2 wonderful guests, Max Wolpert and Sarah Hubbard. Max is related to me. And so I'm very excited that you 2 are here. And, musicians have had a very rich history of being involved with protest and social action for a long, long time in America. And it's interesting, I was thinking about this. There actually has not been quite as much of that, I feel like, kind of this time around with a lot of this, but there has been in Colorado. And so Max and Sarah live just outside of Boulder and have been really involved with the protests around Elijah McClain and a lot of the police quote reform work going on out there. So we're bringing them here to share some about that experience and explore that a bit. So we'll let you guys introduce yourselves more and go from there.
Cool. Well, thank you for having us. I'll just say I'm Sarah Hubbard. I am a violinist based out of Boulder, Colorado, and I work with a number of groups around here, musical groups. So for me, bringing music into protests, and we'll talk, I guess, probably at length a little more about the violin vigil, but that seemed like a very natural progression from what I was already doing.
Right. Well, and of course, one of those groups is the Flowbots. Which,
yes.
Which has been very involved in a lot of social justice work, and a lot of your songs relate to that. And that's a pretty well-known group in certain circles, anyway.
I think so. Yeah. Had a couple of decent songs, I think.
A couple of decent songs. Something about a bicycle, I think.
Yeah. And so their work has been, there's been some work with them that we'll talk about, but they've been involved with local protests, and they've been so keyed into the Denver scene. Many of them are native Denverites, which is, we talk about kind of being a rare thing now, that there aren't a lot of people are transplants. So for us, I'm a transplant, but they're very keyed into their community and have been doing the work for a really long time, and have continued through the last few months of everything going on.
Right.
Yeah, and my name's Max. I am also a musician out here, a fiddle player and a composer. And I am currently working on a doctorate at the university here and teach there. So I'm trying to also stay involved, not only with the stuff that's going on down in Denver, but also working with folks who are on campus and involved in campus and the university population here. And then also, as Sarah said, being involved particularly with things surrounding Elijah McClain, which is particularly poignant to both of us as violinists, because he also was a violinist.
Right. Yeah, so maybe that would be a great place to start. You guys could tell us, for those who don't know who he is, could say a little bit about that. And then, yes, the great violin vigil and your leadership role in Antifa, which much, apparently.
You were mentioning the sort of history of music and protest, and I was actually just thinking about that in terms of Antifa, right? Woody Guthrie's famous guitar label that says "This machine kills fascists." Woody Guthrie was the original Antifa.
Yeah.
We all missed it.
Whoa!
He was a founding member.
I mean, it was like he had his confession of his violent crimes written right on his guitar.
right there on the guitar.
Right.
Such brazen, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Radicalized by Woody Guthrie.
There we go.
So yeah, I mean, I guess Red is the sort of the background for folks who don't know. Elijah McClain lived in Aurora, which is just east of Denver, and it's sort of the largest of the Denver metro area suburbs. Actually, just the population of Aurora proper is almost exactly the same as the population of Minneapolis proper. And so he lived in a neighborhood sort of just off of the freeway, and was walking home from a convenience store with a bottle of iced tea that he picked up for his family. And the sort of, I guess, the context of the story that's worth noting is that Elijah McClain was a tiny guy and was anemic, and so even when it was warm out, he oftentimes wore like a balaclava with a ski mask, to keep warm. Someone in his neighborhood saw a black man walking around wearing a ski mask and called the cops. 3 police officers from the Aurora Police Department showed up, beat the crap out of him, put him in a chokehold, and then paramedics showed up, and the cops had him injected with enough ketamine to sedate a 225-pound man. Elijah McClain was 135 pounds. And so he was then taken to a hospital where he died, I think, 3 days later?
He was in a coma, I believe, and was declared brain dead. And yeah, 3 days later, he was dead.
So this was last August that this happened. The Aurora chief of police, immediately after this happened, retired. And there were some small protests and things that were organized last fall, but it really has sort of exploded at scale since George Floyd, and since the pandemic has made it so that people can't go to work. So there's a lot more people who are going out to protests.
Right. Yeah, and so one of the events that was organized was this, Sarah, you mentioned this violin vigil. So
right.
What was that?
There was a planned violin vigil organized that was going to have, and it did end up having two sort of guest violinists who came from, I think, both from out of state, Lee England Jr. and Ashanti Floyd.
Yeah, Ashanti Floyd's from Atlanta. I think Lee is from New York.
And so they're pretty prominent violinists in the community, in sort of the string community. So it was a big deal to have them there. And this gained traction. We knew that it was going to be happening the same day as protests that would be happening earlier in the day. And the protests, I believe, were organized by numerous groups. I believe there were some student-led ones. There might have been a PSL one. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, they did the afternoon one.
They did the afternoon. So we ended up arriving a little later just because we had instruments, and it was a hot day. We didn't want to have them out in the sun all day. So we arrived pretty close to when the vigil was going to start, which was at 8:30. We got there around 8:15. We were walking, and in order to get to the park where it was supposed to happen, you kind of had to cut across this greenway. And as we were walking there, we could hear on like a bullhorn or some sort of microphone, police addressing the crowd. It didn't sound good. I heard something about chemical weapons, and I heard the crowd start booing, and all of a sudden the crowd started running towards us, and these plumes of smoke, ostensibly from some sort of tear gas canister, just erupted. and kept going. And so we began falling back, and it became clear, like, are we going to actually be able to make it over to where this park is hosting this? And the police were very aggressively advancing on people who had their instruments out of their cases. It wasn't just, and they shouldn't have been advancing on protesters, but it wasn't just people who were there for protest. It was like also, there were children with violins.
This was the start of the vigil, essentially.
This was the start of the vigil.
Yeah.
The vigil hadn't even really been able to begin yet. And meanwhile, I think it's important to note that there was there were people that had made it over for the vigil at that point, that had gotten there early. We knew a few people who were already at the park. So we just weren't going to be able to make it the way that the police had sort of blockaded that area, and advanced on people, beating with batons, spraying in the face at point blank range. It was pretty grim and pretty brutal. And so eventually the organizers, we fell back to a parking lot, and that's where the police stopped pursuing. And some protesters stayed in the parking lot. Some people who had been tear gassed were sort of addressing their needs there, diluting their eyes, washing out their eyes, sort of regrouping, figuring out what the next step was. For people who had instruments, we were called together by some of the organizers, and they said, we're going to go to this little median that was like on the side of the road. It was a tiny space. I don't know how they got us all there. But they brought us out to the median, and that's where we held the vigil. And I'd say the vigil for us was very successful, but it ended up splintering. There were multiple parties. And Max, if you want to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the way that Aurora City Center Park, which was where we were supposed to be having this, is this a sort of large open quadrangle between a bunch of Aurora's municipal buildings. So there's a police station there, City Hall is there, the court building. There's a public library building. There's a bunch of different buildings sort of in this whole area. Where we were was sort of in this quadrangle between the court building and the library. And what the police ended up doing when they forced people out of that park, which is where we were supposed to be having the vigil, they advanced in a pattern that splintered the group up together. So people got forced out of the park on one side of the public library building, on the other side of the building, and even the third direction too. So what ended up happening, where we sort of reformed, was only a small portion of the total group that was there, and other people reformed in sort of other areas. So there ended up being several different vigils, each like a quarter mile apart. A lot of our string player friends and colleagues that we know were down there, we never saw. We couldn't find them because they were in a separate group from we were.
Right, and so then after this, Aurora made it out that all this was done to defend against this battalion of Antifa that was getting ready
to defend us. Yeah, to defend us.
Yes, to defend you guys against the horde of Antifa that was going to attack the vigil and burn the police station down.
Yeah, because their evidence for this, that they saw some people wearing bike helmets, and there was a pile of rocks as part of the landscaping next to the police station. That someone might throw at somebody.
Just like landscaping rocks that are among
you have the little like nice sort of pebble thing on the So I don't know. Maybe the landscape architects were all Antifa, and they planned this like 3 years ago when they redid the park. I don't know.
That'll show them.
It's like there's a book that all the cops read, and it includes that there's a chapter on mystery rocks, because there's always some sort of like rocks that they're afraid are going to get thrown as justification for things. And
and right, not only that were there people with bike helmets, but then there were also people with masks, which was supposedly a sign of Antifa, even though I guess they forgot there's a pandemic and people were wearing masks.
And people who were handing out water bottles. This was the other thing. So one of Aurora City Council members described people handing out water bottles as a combat medical station. So good thing to know that Aurora, Colorado is a war zone. Apparently, I was handing out water bottles. That was what I was doing when we got there. I had an armful of water bottles, so I guess I was a combat medical station.
Yeah,
it's astonishing though how effective these the sort of spin is, because my family is pretty conservative, and whenever I've been down at like interstate shutdowns, the stories they hear of like are just violent, angry rioters whipping, like wanting to tear police officers apart with their bare hands, and people buy that. They don't, because they can't imagine a bunch of folks protesting and kind of being chill about it, which is almost always how it is. There's kind of there's an energy, but people are kindly. Like you bump into someone else at a protest, you're just like, oh, sorry. Like that's just normal life. But then always after the fact, I hear about how ragey and violent, and terrifying it is.
Yeah. Well, and particularly this one, right? It's a protest full of musicians. We're all just like, this is just a bunch of violin nerds hanging out in a park. Like, right, if you bump into someone there, it's like, oh, hey, do you like Billy in the Low Ground? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to make a joke because, we all know violinists aren't violent, but if they had bassoons, then you have to be.
Yeah, watch out for the double reed players. They've got knives on their person at all times.
Right. I think the thing that is so interesting to me about the water bottle thing is like how every protest I've been to, people are there are people who have like these bike rigs where they're towing a ton of water bottles and they're biking through marches to make sure everyone's hydrated, make sure everyone is doing okay.
And people have snacks.
Well, particularly again, it's Colorado in the summer, right? It's 100 degrees at these things. The ones that are happening during the day, it's broiling and everybody's yelling. So yeah, you need water.
And so to take that and spin it as it was warfare, it's like so outrageous.
Well, and I think though what's very, very interesting and important about this, and this is the real challenge, I think, in terms of the social transformation that we're trying to talk about, right, is that for white people in the suburbs, right, for whom the system works, right, for whom the police are their friends and maybe they're related to some police officer, their assumption is, right, that the state works for me and the state tells the truth. And in fact, that is how the police are constructed, right, to work for those people. And so it really does not occur to them that these folks are going to get up and just blatantly lie about stuff, right? I mean, that just doesn't enter your mind. And so if it doesn't enter your mind, you simply accept, and they showed that one photo, right, of three guys with their bikes and their bike helmets and their masks. And they're like, oh, of course, that's Antifa. It's like, those were three guys with masks and bike helmets because they biked to the protest.
Right.
Well, and this is the other very interesting thing, right? That and this is something that we've noticed at some of the other things that we've gone to as well, which is that people who come to a lot of these things, at everything that we've gone to, there's been at least one protester who's carrying a gun. Now, in the state of Colorado, that's completely legal, and people are allowed to do that. If you have an open carry permit, you can carry a gun in public. And the police have been using that, particularly when it's black men who have guns, right? The police have been using that as like, well, we were scared and we were threatened because there was someone with a gun. And it's like, well, wait a minute. This is supposedly legal in the United States. This is our Second Amendment right to carry a firearm. So what? I'm supposed to be totally fine if I'm sitting in a coffee shop and somebody walks in with a pistol, but the police can freak out and pepper spray that person?
And in my
just because they have a gun?
Right. And I feel like it wasn't so long ago that didn't we have all these protests like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, people who didn't want to wear masks, carrying assault
rifles outside the Capitol.
Yeah.
Right. And none of them got pepper sprayed. So,
no.
All right. We've got our first comment from Ellen.
I was wondering how long it'd take for this pun to make it. It sounds like someone commented they really noticed the violins, and someone overheard them and thought they said there's violence. Thanks, Ellen. You brought the pun magic. Ellen, thank you.
Yeah,
there it is.
But we should pause and say that our time is rolling through. So if you've got comments or questions, and please throw those up there. And as I said, the half hour flies by. So I do want to jump to this next thing because we've talked some over the weeks about the issue of activism and organizing and kind of applying pressure points to the system. So I want to get to this Greenwood thing because I think this is extremely interesting. So just to set that up a little bit, one of the things that the Colorado legislature actually did was to enact a law requiring police to have personal liability insurance. And then this other suburb, the town of Greenwood, then passed a law trying to overturn that law, basically saying that they would cover any liability damage. And so then what happened? What did you guys organize and do?
Well, the Flowbots collaborated with a number of other Denver, Colorado musicians, including Nathaniel Rateliff and the Night Sweats, the Lumineers, Devotchka, Spirit of Grace. There's a number of bands in the area. They collaborated to sort of find a pressure point and apply pressure. And so in this case, Greenwood Village has a huge venue called Fiddler's Green. It is, I imagine, a very large revenue builder for the city. Nathaniel Rateliff, I think I read that he played like 3 sold-out nights there in the last year.
Yeah. So he was currently in negotiation to book another round of shows there for this coming year.
Yeah, when it was possible. Now, he's not interested in making money for a city as long as they're trying to find these loopholes or workarounds for SB 217, which is the Colorado legislature for police reform. So he decided, okay, I'm going to get this group of musicians together. We are going to say we are not playing Fiddler's Green in Greenwood Village until they rectify this. Mm-hmm. This is a boycott, and we will let everybody else know who plans on playing there. We will let other musicians know. We will band together and really put the heat on them. And so he also organized a sort of protest and march of sorts. A protest concert, which was followed by a march in a park in Greenwood Village that was, it was right downtown. I guess it was right next.
Yeah, right next to City Hall.
Right next to City Hall. I think it might have been near a police station. I'm not super familiar with their downtown, but it was a really successful concert. People showed up. They socially distanced, which was great. We had a lot of musicians there. Nathaniel played. Wes from the Lumineers played. The Flowbots we got to play. Spirit of Grace was there. And then the Brothers of Brass Band, which is incredible. They're sort of a staple at so many protests. Like every protest you go to, if you go to 3 protests or more around Denver, you've probably seen them. They're at everything.
Amazing.
And they are a brass band that they are leading marches. They led our march. They are really fabulous musicians and people. So they led us. It was a short march, and it was really interesting because I kept thinking, like, man, this just really, like, it feels really good. Like, I don't feel, particularly threatened right now at all. And there was like, oh, the police aren't here. Like, they're for us. But I kept thinking, like, well, maybe when we get back, they're going to be blockaded, lining up for us. But there wasn't anything like that.
Well, and this is a really interesting point, right? Because before this, there was a first protest in Greenwood Village right after they passed this bill, where the police did show up. They blocked off the street with a snowplow and sent in a bunch of cops to disperse everybody by force. And so then, of course, there was a huge mess, right? There was a bunch of agitation and violence and all the stuff that supposedly, is caused by rowdy protesters and Antifa. And then at this one, the police just weren't there. And everything was fine.
Yeah, I mean, it was a celebration of sorts, as much as it was a protest. It felt just a completely different vibe than any other protest I've ever been at. Where incredible what happened in the show.
Yeah, and amazingly enough, right, Antifa didn't show up and destroy the town.
Yeah, nobody got hurt.
Strange.
Nothing got set on fire. Like. We just had a block party. It was great.
Yeah. All right, we've got some great comments that have come in, so why don't we roll through those?
From Gus, the cops are bullies. That's why they use these flimsy justifications for government-sponsored violence. Bullies always need a justification.
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretty accurate there.
Yep.
Next comment from Bobby. Wondering how much we learned from past atrocities at Kent State. What is the difference between these protests and how close we are to another incident like Kent State in the 70s? That's terrifying, but
Yeah.
Well, and I've actually thought about Kent State a lot as I've seen these situations in Portland. And for those who are not aware of what that was, and again, for folks who are talking about that what's happening in Portland with federal troops there is different or new or whatever, it's not. This has been happening for a long time. And so Kent State, as with many college campuses around the country, were occupied by the National Guard, and they shot 6 students and killed them. And, very similar sorts of things to what we're talking about. The students are protesting, and the presence of the cops or the military is really what triggers the violence and even promotes the violence.
That's right. Coming from Kathleen, I was very sympathetic toward the police until I served as a volunteer police chaplain. I was so disgusted by what I saw and heard that I had to quit. Then I didn't feel safe because I knew they had no interest in protecting me.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and a friend of mine posted a similar kind of thing, Kathleen, a little while back about how he did this ride along with a cop who had been, I guess, a childhood friend of his, and he was sort of curious, what that would be like. And he said it was the most terrifying night of his life because basically his friend and his friend's fellow officers were just driving around looking for people to harass. Right. And they finally ended up almost killing this black man while this guy was sitting in the car watching. And he said it was just a complete nightmare and really difficult.
Well, and if I could sort of chime in on that, one interesting thing that we've learned about Aurora in light of all of this and the sort of scrutiny on their police department, the city of Aurora has a bond fee in place where anytime anybody has to pay bail, on top of that, they have to pay between $50 and $100 to the city for the privilege of paying bail. And that just goes right into the city. So the city is actively using the police essentially as a fundraising tool. And so not only is there this sort of cultural thing of the police being police, they're actually financially incentivized to harass and arrest people. Yeah. And I'm sure that this is not a unique situation.
No. I was going to say this happens all over the country. One of the things we found out, in Ferguson was that a third of the Ferguson police budget came from stop and frisk parking tickets. Wow. Traffic tickets. And so that was one of the reasons that the level of harassment and stopping of black people was so high, because the city depended on that money for their budget.
And going back to what you were saying about, the sort of suburban folks thinking, okay, the police are here to protect us, a large part of what they're actually here for is to squeeze money out of people. And, if there was a shift in that perspective.
Here's a comment from Mark Tibbles. I realize this is a radical statement, but you can't have state violence without a state to perpetrate the violence. Sometimes I can't contain the anarchist in me. Who am I kidding? I can't contain it. Solidarity, Mark.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not really a radical statement. It's sort of a logic statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and this is what becomes the problem with the state, right? Is that the state then needs to perpetuate itself in certain ways, and we really are having this kind of titanic struggle right now over what is the nature of the state in America, and and you can see how real this is when you have, Senator Tom Cotton yesterday gets up and basically says we need to outlaw education about the American history of slavery. And he wants to censor the 619 project, which is this New York Times educational project about slavery. And, this guy's serious, right? This is a United States senator that wants to not allow us to teach the history of slavery in school in America. And there's only one reason for that, which is to maintain whiteness. I mean, it's not a big secret.
Yeah, while you're at it, you better stop teaching the American Revolution. Otherwise, people might get the idea that protests are a good idea and work.
Yeah, really.
So,
That's right.
all right. Well, we've zoomed through our time, but this has been really great. So thank you so much for your great work, and keep on keeping on. And we'll, of course, be in touch and tuning in. It's great to have these folks around the country that we know kind of getting the info on the ground. We've got Gus watching out for the robot birds in Portland. Yeah.
Well, I forgot about those.
You can't forget about the robot birds. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot. It's been really great.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
So long.